Hello, everyone. This is Ed Brendiger, and welcome to the Eddy Network podcast. My guest today is Alan Rayner, who is a scientist and an artist and a fascinating fellow. And I'm really pleased that you are with us today. And so, Alan, please tell us who you are and tell us a little bit about the life that you've lived and what you do. And then I have a follow-up question after you say that.
Well, thank you very much for having me to begin with and for inviting me to be with you. Yes, I'm reaching the age of 70, towards the age of 73, so I've been around for quite a while. I've actually been retired from work as such since just 12 years ago, at which point I really needed to leave what for me was actually a hard and stressful atmosphere of a work culture that was dominated by rationalistic thought. And I needed to get away from it because it was causing me stress. But also I needed the freedom to be able to explore more fully my understandings of natural inclusion, which I'll talk about in due course. But I'll say now that I regard it as the most fundamental evolutionary process that there is. And it goes way beyond the way we've been taught to think of evolution in terms of Darwinian selection, which I refuse to call natural selection because it isn't. It's a product of an abstraction, of an abstract rationality, which is not really, to my mind, true to nature. Now, why would I say all that? I've had a very kind of unusual life. I suppose most people by the stage I've got to will have had one. I was born in Kenya, in Nairobi, in Africa.
Oh, really?
In 1950. At the time when the Mau Mau rebellion was beginning to start,
Yeah.
my mother was a well-known politician. So well known, she was about to be mayor of Nairobi when we left Nairobi, and suddenly, due to my father's illness in 1958. So the first 8 years or nearly 8 years of my life were in Kenya, in Nairobi, in Africa. And I was running around in a wild African garden, climbing trees, encountering all sorts of dangers, snakes, biting insects, all sorts of dangers in many ways. Eventually, I climbed too far up a tree and nearly killed myself falling from it. And that was probably one of the most traumatic moments of my early life. And within actually just about a month or so, just after that incident, my father had a stroke and we had to return to Britain. Up until that time, I'd hardly been to school. I'd been sort of to kindergarten school briefly, and I just started at another school at which I was desperately unhappy, as it happened. But then it suddenly came back to Britain, to the United Kingdom with my parents, so that my father could be treated, and found myself in London, in grey, cold London.
It's not Nairobi, that's for sure.
From that, yeah, so that was a big change, and I found myself being sent to school in London and discovering that they were still working in pounds, shillings, and pence, which meant that I had terrible difficulty in arithmetic classes because I had to do. I thought of everything in decimals, and so on. It was kind of quite a traumatic thing, initiation into schooling. But I was also my parents had very high expectations of me. My father had been to King's College, Cambridge, and he desperately wanted me to go to King's College, Cambridge. But I had somehow to manage this by going to a very, very high pressure school and then following a path which was very strictly, in many ways, wittingly or unwittingly, laid out before me. And so I followed that path with difficulty, but I did eventually get to King's College, Cambridge. I did eventually get the degree he wanted me to get. And I did eventually embark following almost entirely in his footsteps on a career in academic mycology, teaching all about, learning and researching all about fungi, which I did all the way through till 1998, when I was president of the British Mycological Society, then promptly broke down. The breakdown essentially was because all the way through this process of following a path that had been laid out for me, and a path which was very scientific and biological and dominated in the background by Darwinian theory, I was encountering a way of thinking which was foreign to me, and which actually scared me, because it was so kind of categorical and intolerant of human error.
Pardon my interrupting here.
Yep.
Was it, I'm going to use the word alien. Was it alien to you because of your first 8 years in Kenya, where you were immersed in a natural world that was not bounded by institutional structures?
I think that's exactly right. Yes, I think so. It may be something to do with my psychology as well, but it was certainly alien to me. And certainly this right or wrong, categorical approach was always a problem to me. And I particularly became distressed by the work of Richard Dawkins on what was called the selfish gene, because I felt if he was right, if neo-Darwinism is right, then what place is there for compassion? Now, there are two aspects, two values that are carried with me right from childhood, and one was honesty, always doing the best you possibly can to speak what you believe to be true, and not making things up just to suit your purposes. And the other was compassion, as I say, this sense that the great need to understand ourselves as human beings, as essentially the way we are is extraordinarily dependent on circumstance. And so the idea that we can be independent, free-minded, individuals was problematic to me. And I was actually quite bothered indeed by notions of eugenics, which of course originated directly from Darwinian thinking.
Right.
And I felt the need somehow to find a way in which that couldn't be true.
Are you saying that the world that you were forced to work in was one where the human person is sort of an atomistic, individualized entity being without any necessary relationship or connection to the world outside of their being? Is that what you're saying? And so let me take that one step further. And therefore, if that is true, then it explains a lot of why the world is in the shape it's in.
That's right. That's exactly right. Essentially, it's treating the human being as a high performance machine.
Yeah. I'm so with you on this. I mean, this is what I've been writing about this morning. I mean, this
well, very good, because I mean, one of my favorite phrases was performance related love.
Yeah, I call that transactional love.
Well, whatever is the idea that you could only, and actually, that was part of my schooling, was that that one had to come top of the class, otherwise you were worthless, which was a pretty dreadful way to bring up a child, really, when you think about it. But all the while, I suppose, this was the sort of undercurrent, and I had it within my mycological work, because the way that I understood fungi and the way that I understood their relationships with the natural world, and how they relate in particular to trees. My final my final address to the British Mycological Society was called Fountains of the Forest, and it featured an oil painting of mine of that, called that. But it was essentially looking at the relationship, what has now become hugely trendy. But I was there a long, long while ago. Everyone now thinks it's new, but it isn't. I sort of worked out about the hidden networks of fungi and how they communified trees brought them together into a natural community with all sorts of ramifications associated with that. And I saw fungi very clearly. They illustrated or demonstrated for me that they were all flow forms, that the way you understood fungi was to understand them as a flow. And the way and ultimately the way you understand everything is to understand it as a product of flow. And that, of course, is what all my paintings are saying. So here's one just that I put aside earlier for you, but essentially it is illustrating the basic idea that all natural tangible form is a product of flow. So what I call flow form. And hence to try to define it, to put it in a box in any way at all, to any attempt to define what is naturally fluid and continuous, to categorize it or even put it in a hole with a W, for me was a big mistake. It was failing to understand the very nature of the evolutionary process as a process of flow. Mm-hmm. So the creativity of the natural evolutionary process is the creativity of flow itself. And one of the features about where I was when I was a little boy, as down at the bottom of our garden was a river. It was the River Nairobi. And I got used to the idea of flow. And I got used to the idea very, very much. And I loved the idea of the river both shapes and is shaped by the landscape.
Yep.
So you've got this simultaneous relationship going on between the flow of the river and the landscape. So each is simultaneously informing the other. You can't isolate the flow of the river from the flow of the landscape. They are co-creative. So that was a big deal. I wrote all about that in a book, which was sort of shortly before, which is, if you can see that, it's called Degrees of Freedom.
Uh-huh.
And the subtitle is Living in Dynamic Boundaries. And what I was doing at that stage was recognizing that all natural boundaries are intrinsically dynamic. They're not definitions, they're not limits. They are interfacings between the inner world and the outer world through which natural distinctions arise. And that relates to something Wordsworth said, which I love very much. My daughter pointed it out to me one day, which was, in nature, everything is distinct, yet nothing defined into absolute independent singleness.
Oh, absolutely. Totally agree.
So he was recognizing, I would add one word, I would say everything is dynamically distinct, but never defined it to absolute independent singleness. And that gives the lie to all our rationalistic thought. Because if all our rationalistic thought is based on the idea of an independent one, an isolated entity as one, definable in itself,
right,
you're in big trouble. Because, and in fact, almost all our conventional mathematics is based on that on that principle of defining one as one alone. And evermore shall be so. There's a sort of song about that called Green Grind the Rushes.
Yeah, I see that. I've seen that in my own work as a organizational consultant, where people at the top level of the hierarchy see themselves as sort of in charge, and that they have the prerogative to make all the decisions, and no one else may make decisions.
Yeah.
And it is a way to restrict the capacity of the company, the organization, the community, or the family in a pretty severe way, so that it does not have any dynamism, and so it creates all kinds of problems. So I've written a lot about brokenness in organizations, but it's exactly what you're describing. It's this segmenting of things so that things do not have a necessary relationship or the capacity for relationship.
Yeah.
And
it's the insistence on definition. When someone says, I must define this, when someone starts an essay with a definition, I used to say to students, if you start the essay with a definition, it's dead.
well,
because you've given yourself no chance to break out of that into the flow of the essay.
It's like the first book I wrote called Circle of Impact. The people that were helping me produce that, they kept wanting to know, so who is this for? And they were not asking who is this for, but what title within an organizational structure is this for? Is it for the CEO? Is it for the HR department? I said, no, it's for people who are in transition. And they could never wrap their head around that. They didn't know what to do with that. And
no. Well, when you look at the way that all of us have, in Western culture at least, been taught to think and to do mathematics and to use language, indeed, in this very, very definitive, categorical way. We've all been taught to think that way, and it's actually quite a hard one to get out of. Unless for some reason, maybe because I'd had my background in Africa, I couldn't think that way. And I experienced the stress of trying to think that way. And I realized, I used to make silly mistakes in school with arithmetic, simply because I found it so difficult to sort of handle the basic ideas of whole numbers and fractions. And
I have a similar experience. My first 10 years, I was very free. I could walk out the door at 7 in the morning, not come home till 7 at night. My mother would never wonder where I was, and I would, I was climbing trees and walking, get up on the roof of the house and looking off to the horizon, and then my buddies and I, we'd crawl through the storm drains of the street. I mean, we would do it. We were doing all kinds of things that were just natural for young boys to go do. And it had an effect upon me until fourth grade, when my fourth grade teacher, Millie Brown, jerked a knot in me because I was just being a boy, active. And so I was staying after school 1 or 2 days a week, and she had me copying pages out of the elementary school dictionary. And I credit her with my discovery of a love for words. So it's similar, maybe that we start education too young. Maybe we should wait until later and then treat it differently than what we are doing.
I really think that's true. I think that we're educating ourselves out of a decent life currently, by teaching in a way that doesn't open up possibilities. Truly, for me, that's what education really means, is leading out into wider awareness.
Right.
And it's what, as an educator, I used to try to do with students. And some students loved it, and some students, of course, said, just tell me what I need to do to pass the exam. And they got very, very stroppy when I was trying to show them the beauty. I was trying to show them the beauty and the diversity of the living world.
As they say, you can lead a horse to water.
The exam. Yeah.
As they say, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink.
Very much so. And this is part of it too, is this particular way of thinking can't be forced by its very nature. In fact, it recognizes that force, as thought of in Newtonian mechanics, doesn't exist. That the most fundamental life is much more fundamentally about influence, about an invitational presence which calls into formation. And that's natural inclusion. If we go deep into natural inclusion now, it's that recognition of at the heart of any, it's actually understanding the nature of gravity in a very different way from how current physics does, is essentially an understanding that every numerical entity is centered on zero. It's not either one or zero, it's one as a dynamically including zero within infinite space. So you're recognizing that fundamentally we've shifted out of a definitive approach to mathematics to a dynamical approach, truly dynamical, in which you see that every numerical identity, is dynamically informed. And if it's dynamically informed, then it can't exist instantaneously. Yeah. So in other words, every material body all material bodies are, they can't exist in no time. And
true.
And
so is there an inner, what I'm hearing you say is that there's an energy that's in the middle of this, and this natural inclusion is an energy that draws people.
Yeah, I would actually, if we actually think of it's in very simple terms, one of the things that bothered me at school was when I was told that vacuums don't suck. Okay. And I thought, of course vacuums suck. And that's actually the whole point, which I spell without it.
What were they meaning by that?
Well, they basically, it was a lesson at school where when we were studying Archimedean pumps or whatever, I can't remember, yeah. But and you said if you lifted the piston up, it would draw water up. But you couldn't say it was sucking water up. You had to say the water was being forced up by atmospheric pressure from outside. But it very, very interesting, because there's this, it almost immediately introduces you to this very, very big problem of of the rational mind abhorring a vacuum. It's not nature that abhors a vacuum. Nature is a vacuum. Which is populated by energetic motion. So it's actually looking at this, so that we're looking at a receptive influence, an innermost calling, the zero, which is calling motion into circulation around itself. Okay, and when you think about that, that's actually a perfectly good explanation for atomic theory and quantum theory without getting into huge, complicated depth.
It's a good theory for a lot of things, because I see that I'm going to probably be inaccurate in the way I describe what I think you're saying, is that all kinds of interactions that we have with people, we're either drawn towards them or we are repelled by them.
Yeah.
If we're talking about two different entities, the drawing may be because they are calling us to them, or the repelling is because they are drawing something else that's coming to them that is pushing us away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I see that as a natural way of understanding relationships, that they don't exist. I've had people tell me that they don't believe in relationships. They believe in exchange, transactional exchange. They see that as And but I see the relationships, not just human relationships, but relationships to nature, to creation, that sort of thing, is really the sum total of everything. Everything is in relationship. And if you can grasp that, then you can live a very large and expansive life, because that which you have identified as this context of relationship is really reality, and you can see reality far beyond what we normally think of as kind of a social construction that just suits us because it's a way of kind of avoiding responsibility or using it as a source of power or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And this is where I talk about receptive responsive relationship. A relationship between receptive stillness. I mean, real space, natural space is an intangible presence. It's a vacuum, in a sense. Yeah, so it's a void. So in a sense, it's not actually pulling, but it's attracting energy into circulation. So so you only have to think of a vortex to really understand this basic idea of energy circulating around a receptive center of influence. And that you can also think of in terms of the relationship between gravity and energetic flow. And ultimately, you can think of it in terms of the true nature of electromagnetism, I understand. That you're actually looking at this relationship between these two vital aspects of the natural world, which is essentially spatial stillness, which is receptive, and energetic motion, which is responsive.
Yeah.
And it's these together that co-create natural tangible form. So we understand all natural material form, all natural tangible form as a product of a receptive responsive relationship between intangible spatial stillness and energetic excitation.
So this is a very good way to talk about the nature of change.
Yeah.
And Heraclitus, everything is change, and that's true. But what I found, I mean, you've worked in the natural sciences. I've worked in the social sciences. In large categories, but there is this connection between the two, which we are identifying here, which I think is really important. What I have found is that there's a vast number of people in the world who want to have no change. They want to be at a static or a stasis situation, and as a result, they're in an isolated state from an awareness of who they are and what their potential is. And so you only learn who you are. You only come to self-knowledge by being in motion, by doing things, by learning things, by trying things, by testing things. I mean, all these things that, I mean, let me just say it this way. I'm convinced that if we understood science in the proper way, not as an academic or a commercial or a political entity, but as science in its pure sense, that it would really show us how to relate to the world and how to work with one another, and understand the spiritual realm, which is denied at the same as well. So that's where I come from. I'm not a scientist, but I'm interested in that scientific process. So this leads me to a question for you, because you obviously have a different mindset, a different philosophy, a different perspective on science than what we find in a lot of academic institutions. So how did you manage that working in academia and then becoming the head of this society that obviously is a significant station for you in your life and your work. What happened there? How did that all work out?
Well, as I say, that I was under a great deal of pressure, of expectation, and so I learned to play the game.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, the game caught up with me, and I felt I couldn't play the game any longer. I mean, if you like, I I had a Damascene conversion from abstract science to truly natural science.
Yeah, yeah.
Because what you're talking about is what I talk about as truly natural science.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is truly based in an attunement and understanding, a full and comprehensive awareness of the natural world and our human place within that natural world. That is, for me, true natural science. I actually got a natural science degree because I was at Cambridge, and that's what they called it. But what I was actually taught was abstract science, which is essentially this, you know, it will, if you like, atomistic, reductionistic science.
Yeah.
Like many people, having been exposed to reductionistic science, and seeing that there's a problem here, I, for a while, moved towards holistic science. But then I also saw that there was a problem in holistic science, and that the real natural science was truly a bringing together of each, into a true synthesis. It's the old classic antithesis and, thesis and antithesis gives rise to synthesis. Well, essentially, natural inclusion. It's not natural conclusion because it's never ending, but natural inclusion is a true dynamical synthesis of opposing points of view, which actually one ultimately understands as reciprocities, not opposites.
I'm really fascinated by this, Alan, because I mean we've only met in the last few months. So last fall, I had this notion, it was in late November, that I should write about synthesis, and all I was reflecting on is all the times that professors, I'm a seminary graduate, so we talked a lot about Hegelian synthesis of thesis, antithesis.
Yeah.
And I never liked the idea because I always felt like it was far too binary. It was not complex enough.
Yeah.
And it minimized the real dynamism that exists in the world. And if you as I do place God in the midst of that, it just does not make any sense. It doesn't hold together. And so I'm thinking, okay, is there another way of looking at synthesis? And I wrote 17 different posts on this between the end of November and the end of January. And at that point I said, I'm just banging my head against the wall. I really don't know what I'm talking about. And I need to step back and go, think about it some more. And so that's what I'm doing. And so I'm going to share this with you because I'd like to hear your response. And so I was out on a 3-week road trip across the United States. I was seeing clients and going to meetings and stuff like that. And this perception of the world came to me, the perception of reality, that there are these I'm calling them 3 orders of reality. And they're hierarchical, and it starts at the top, which is spiritual, which is the world of relationship, and it's the world of reality. It's the entire, everything that exists that is real, and it is in that spiritual realm. The second level is that of the intellectual or the abstract. And then the third level is that of culture, of the built culture, where the abstractions become concrete. And what I was realizing was that we have turned this upside down. So we are allowing the built culture, the culture, human culture, to define the intellectual and define define reality when it's really the opposite. It's only this spiritual large culture which we are not able to access the entirety of, which really defines what the abstract and the concrete can be.
Yeah, this is exactly how I would feel, is essentially that the culture has been fossilized or reified or whatever you like, and past its fossilization. So everything is literally back up topsy-turvy. We interpret the world back to front or upside down or whichever way, or outside in, or whichever way you want to look at it. Is that, if you look at current thinking, and it's one of the things I do almost as an exercise, is someone presents me with a statement, and I'll automatically turn it around and think, how does it work the other way around? And this is actually, one of the nicest principles of this idea, which actually sort of relates rather well, is the invention of safari parks. Because when the problem was seen to be putting animals in cages, you reversed it and put the humans in cages. Yeah, and had all the animals around you.
Poetic justice.
So it is that sort of switch around of priority of understanding, and again, it's actually a form of deep humility. Truly deep humility, in which you don't feel yourself as on top of or bigger or whatever than everything else, but actually the other way around. You feel yourself as literally an inclusion of all else, and a dynamical inclusion of all else at that. So is this turning around? There's the sort of, I've written stuff about this. I mean, primarily it's about this understanding that it's not even everything, it's everywhere. You have to understand everywhere is literally everywhere,
right,
without limit.
Right.
So that's the true nature of infinity,
right,
the true quality of infinity. And it's literally endless, limitless. So what aspect of reality can you think of that is literally limitless? Literally everywhere.
I would say it's consciousness.
No, it's not a trick. Well, I will tell you so that you don't embarrass yourself. Essentially, I'm talking about natural space, the void.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that.
So literally space is everywhere. Okay, so we then question, so what about matter? Is matter everywhere? No, it's only somewhere. So every somewhere is a dynamic inclusion of everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like that. I like
so
that.
Essentially, we're recognizing that every somewhere, every material body is a dynamic inclusion of space everywhere. And because it's dynamic, then we're talking about everywhere as true space-time.
And it means, I'm taking this to mean that whoever you are as a person, wherever you go, you can relate to that place.
Yes. And you can relate to others as equally, as the same, as essentially being, this is what we all have in common.
Right.
That we're all dynamic inclusions of space. Yeah, we're all temporal. Yeah, timely inclusions, and timely means energetic. Yeah, because we're talking about movement here. Timely inclusions of space everywhere. So, when people try to tell you what infinity is, and they say, how long is a piece of string? They're not even begun to, because infinity isn't a quantity. It's a quality of everywhereness, it's a quality of intangibility.
Yeah.
And then somewhereness is actually a quality of temporality. And the two mutually include one another. So you don't split space from time. You don't split, as Einstein actually did, matter from space-time. Okay?
Yeah.
And that's a basic mistake, to my mind. You can't do it. And it's why you couldn't understand quantum mechanics, but equally why quantum mechanics can't understand relativity, because essentially they were splitting what can't be split. Which are these vital aspects of reality, which come ultimately down to these two very fundamental aspects of spatial stillness and energetic motion, excitement. I don't know. I actually find the energetic aspect much harder to understand than I do the spatial.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I just sort of recognize that there has to be, if space is everywhere and matter is only somewhere, then matter has to be dynamically informed. Yeah,
And
that
with
sounds like my tea coming as a bit of dynamic information. Lovely. Thank you.
and would that mean that dynamism is where the energy actually is?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So the spacious is literally a receptive presence, an influence, which draws the energetic, yeah, into.
So I'm thinking about how you apply this, because I think it's a valuable perspective of the world, and it has a how do I want to say it? It has a an evaluative value, if I can butcher the language, for us. So if we were to say, and I'm thinking about my community that's right here, and think of this as a space, and all these people that live here is the matter that exists in this space. And the question is, how do we interact with them, relate to them in such a way that the energy that is present in each one of those people has a way of benefiting other people as they encounter them? And I think
This is yeah.
that's
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt then, but
no,
this is right
I think
at the
that's
heart of it.
where your ideas here, which I think are profound, have an application in the world that most of us live in.
Yes. Now, mechanically, people are used to talking about action and reaction,
Right.
because essentially what happens when you split matter from space is you think of mechanical objects acting and reacting, interacting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Transactional, whatever you like to call it, but essentially you're looking at objects colliding or or whatever. Now, if as soon as you understand this relationship between the receptivity of space and the responsiveness of energy, you move from action and reaction, Newtonian mechanical thinking, which is about machines, it's not about life. You move to receptive, responsive relationship. So we instead of action and reaction, we're talking about reception and response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That actually is about love. Most fundamentally, it's about love, because you're talking about the receptivity of being aware of another person and recognizing your in commonness, but also what makes you different, and you feel it there, and you feel that you want to reach out to that other person because you can feel their attraction, and so essentially this is, to me, the relationship between life and love, most utterly fundamentally. Now we're talking about why we feel compassion, which goes back to my early point. Why do we feel compassion? Because we know how it feels to be in the place of another. And we know how it feels to have a heart and to be a vulnerable,
Right.
to be a vulnerable entity, to have needs. Instead, if Dawkins had written The Needful Gene, it would have been a very different book from The Selfish Gene. And right at the heart of all this is a true and deep recognition of our needs as living creatures, sentient creatures. Does that. So as soon as we have that appreciation, and we know what pain feels like, everybody knows what pain feels like, everybody knows what grief feels like, everyone knows what joy feels like. So when we truly understand that, and you understand that there's a reason for it, this is not irrational. This is not something you put aside and say, oh, well, that's, you know, the material is much more important than this. This is the essence of what's material.
Right.
You know, it's not material that's the essence of emotion, it's emotion that's the essence of
It's
material.
what
In many ways,
makes the material material.
yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
essentially, we're all made of emotion. So you could also talk about the responsive energy, yeah, and the receptive as talking about ourselves,
Right.
and actually going all the way down to subatomic structure as emotional beings, receptive and responsive.
So I want to ask you, I'm diverting from where we are. I want to ask you about your painting and
Yes.
and I know you've been painting since you were a teenager, so I know you've been painting a long time. How are you using your paintings? Are you painting just for yourself? Or are you painting as a way of articulating these ideas to people who are not scientists or have a scientific mind, but rather have a more creative mind, a more maybe more visual, more imaginative mind?
Yeah. I mean, right at the beginning, as I say, I didn't know why I was painting them to begin with, but essentially they were arising as a natural expression from myself of just and to a large extent they're a way I personally have exploring my imagination
Mm-hmm.
and exploring my reality and how my imagination actually relates to reality. So quite a lot of my paintings are actually have a deep root in my biological knowledge.
Right.
But at the same time, they're also playing with that biological knowledge in a way which is more or less dreamlike, or using the imagination very powerfully. And so imagery comes in. I mean, literally, what happens to me with a painting, almost invariably, is I'm just having a cup of tea or whatever. Image comes into my mind straight out of the blue. The entire painting comes at once. Well, then I had a few, but the basic idea, this painting here, I saw that image instantaneously as something, basically a
Can you
keyhole.
just describe the parts of that you were?
Well, essentially, what I was thinking of is the opening out from an enclosed structure into a wider yonder.
Uh-huh.
And people often sort of talk about the key to everything, and I like to talk about the keyhole, which is the opening into everywhere.
Oh, I
Yeah.
like that. I like that
Yeah.
very much.
So I sort of had this image of the keyhole as a symbol of the I
Oh,
self. Yeah. And the
I,
I self that is caged in by a blinking great wall up here, but and wants to break out into the flow. And essentially, so it breaks out, and you can see there's basically a sun at the horizon there, and reflections going. And then, of course, everything is deeply rooted in the ground. Okay, so we're sort of going back to my love of trees as expressions of natural
yeah,
flow form. Essentially, you know, the trees as literally trees as fountains of the forest.
right.
So a tree is a solar-powered fountain is the way that I described the painting I did for the British Mycological Society. No wonder they didn't understand me, but that's maybe.
Well, you combine a lot of different
Yeah.
strengths and skills and abilities in who you are. Well, this has really been wonderful and fascinating, and I've been kind of listening and reading your stuff on LinkedIn, and now, and you're also a poet, right?
Well, yes, because more or less at the time, because I first recognized all boundaries are intrinsically dynamic. It then took me a while to recognize why they were dynamic or how they could possibly be dynamic in terms of this relationship between energy and space. And it was only really when I met a couple of people who were talking all about space in unusual ways to me, that I actually had that eureka moment, and I said to myself, space is the solvent of nature. Just as water is the solvent of life, space is the solvent of all reality. And essentially, it's what makes flow possible. It is utter possibility because of its intangibility. It is essentially open, receptive to possibility. To the possibility for expression. And this again is what a painting does, is you start with a blank sheet or a blank canvas or whatever it may be, which in a sense represents that open receptivity of the spacious. And you then inform it using paint. And that process of informing it, you do in flowing movements. By and large, unless you're a punctualist. But for me, I express this in terms of flowing movement, and it's the movement that creates the form. And so immediately you sort of get this idea of this relationship between the flowing movement and the emergence of natural form as flow form. So all the paintings actually express that, all of them. About that relationship, and you really feel it. I really feel it. It just gives me a surge of pleasure, to actually sort of, it's like
fantastic. That. Well, I guess what we could say is that you have discovered where the openness is in the world, and you're filling it with your life, and we can learn from that. Because I do think that a lot of people feel very closeted in their life, and they're very closed, and they don't know how to get out of that. They know down deep within themselves that they need to, but they're bound by the structures, the social and organizational structures of the world, and that's where the problems are. So, where do people find you if they want to see your work?
Well, there are two websites that you can find me on. I sort of can't draw them to hand now, but the simplest one to go to is https:// and then Authority, spelled OCCURRITY.com. Is it .com or .org? Oops, I can't remember now. But if it goes wrong the first time,
you could send me these links, and I'll put them in the show notes.
Oh yes. No, I'll certainly do that. Yeah. And you're welcome to have a look at them. But I've basically made all my work as accessible as possible. It's as freely available, and you can also find a whole set of essays on Medium. There are 100 essays on Medium, so I've not hidden it away. It's immediately available.
Very good, very good. Well, I thank you for coming on here. This has been fantastic. I feel that I've learned a lot. But I also have learned that I share a lot with you, and that's even better. That's
a lovely feeling, isn't it? Yes, that's good.
Definitely it is, and I hope that others, many of you, feel the same way. What I find, Alan, in the audience here, is that when we have these kinds of conversations, what happens is oftentimes whoever is on the screen is articulating ideas that then people who are listening or watching are saying, oh, well, that explains why I was feeling a certain way. So let me invite you all to comment or send a question, and we'll respond back in turn. And please also subscribe and hit the like button so that we know that you were here. And I'm grateful that you have visited the Eddie Network podcast today, and we'll do this some more. And Alan, thank you for being here, and thank you everyone, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you for your welcome.